April 1644, you had 7 American natives who were arrested at Hempstead on Long Island for allegedly killing 2 or 3 pigs. Later on, come to find out, it was actually some racist British imperialist invaders that had killed the 2 or 3 pigs. It wasn't the American natives whatsoever. So you had Keith, who is the Dutch who had hired John Underhill. So ask yourself, why is Underhill working for the Dutch in the 40s? Why is Underhill, who had burnt down Mystic River Fort, the Mystic River Massacre of Pequot, was John Mason and John Underhill. And here we have John Underhill with the Dutch governor Keft sending Underhill with 16 soldiers to Hempstead to great Pilgrim hero John Underhill goes to Hempstead to take a look at these Native Americans. Who are these Native Americans that are stealing pigs? Who actually didn't steal any pigs. They didn't care if they were guilty or not. They were Native Americans. They were guilty just by being born. So John Underhill goes to Hempstead. He kills 3 of the 7 Native Americans in a cellar. So they're in a cellar, and he just goes in and just, hacks 3 of them to death. Then he takes the other 4 Native Americans, and he puts them on a boat, and he takes 2 of them, and he tows 2 of them behind them in the boat. So they tie a string around their neck, and I guess they're supposed to just hang on to the rope, or maybe they were supposed to be drug around the sea or the river until they drowned, which is exactly what they did. So first, John Underhill, 7 Native Americans are being accused. 3 of them are killed by our great Pilgrim hero, John Underhill. 2 of those have strings around their necks. They're going to drown. Now there's 2 left. The 2 unfortunate survivors were detained as prisoners at Fort Amsterdam, where they were brutally tortured. When the Indian prisoners had been kept a long time in the Cour de Garde, the director became tired of giving them food any longer, and they're delivered to the soldiers to do with as they please. The poor unfortunate prisoners were immediately dragged out of the guardhouse and soon dispatched with knives of from 18 to 20 inches long, which Director Keft had made for his soldiers for such purposes, saying that swords were for use in the huts of the savages when they went to surprise them, but the knives were much handier for boweling them, to cut them up, to gutting them. So this is April 1644. Essentially, John Underhill is a mercenary for both the Dutch and for the British. When it comes to the Native Americans, the 2 last Native Americans was left, and one of them was jumping around or wanted to do the Kente Casey dance, but he was cut up so bad that he just dropped dead, because they're taking these knives, these boweling knives, and they're cutting them up. The last Native American, they're cutting strips from the other's body, beginning at the calves up to the back, cutting up strips of skin, up over the shoulders, down to the knees. This is going on. Governor Keith and his comrade Jean de la Montagne, a Frenchman, the fort physicians, they're laughing. This is so much fun. Governor Keith had so much delight at torturing these innocent Native Americans. They didn't take the pigs. It was the British that took the pigs. But who gives a shit? They're savages anyways. And so when you designate somebody savages, then you can cut skins off their back. You could shoot them in the cellar. You could drag them behind a boat. You could brutally torture the living shit out of them and get a lot of delight. Be a Schadenfreude, a sadist, taking pleasure out of other people's pain. So then eventually the Governor Keith ordered the torture out of the fort. The soldiers took the Native American, the last one, to Beaver's Path, where he was dancing the Kente Casey the entire time, and they threw him down. They cut off his genitals, and they thrust his genitals into his mouth while he was still alive, and at last placing him on a millstone. They decapitate him, so in a way, they finally give him some peace. They're chopping him up. They're ripping pieces of skin off of him. He's doing the Kente Casey dance because he sees that he's about to go home, so he's doing his death dance. What I tell you is true, for by the same token there stood at the same time 24 or 25 female savages who had been taken prisoner at the north point of the fort, and when they saw this bloody spectacle, they held up their arms, struck their mouths, and in their language exclaimed, for shame, such unheard of cruelty was never known or even thought among us. These savages have often called to us from a distance, what scoundrels you Swanakin are! You do not war upon us, but upon our wives and children, who you treacherously murder, whereas we do no harm either to your wives or your children, but feed and take care of them. To make a quick note about this, this is just one little tiny incident that happened in 1644, but it shows you the kind of people that John Underhill hung out with, the shit that John Underhill did. It wasn't just the Mystic River Massacre. They would eventually massacre Stonington, and they would massacre all the Pequot in Fairfield too. So there's a Fairfield Massacre, there's a Stonington Massacre, and then there was the Mystic River Massacre, the Pequot War. And then here in Muncie, they kill all the Muncie, the Wappingers. So it happens. It repeats over and over again. 500 to 700 people were killed in that the Wappingers, the Muncie natives, the Pound Ridge Massacre. It's another thing in Keefe's War. But the same thing with Mystic River Massacre. 500 to 700 members of the Wappinger Confederacy were killed. Well, take some body counts. So in the 1637 Mystic River Massacre, you saw 400 to 800 people get killed. 400 to 800 people. How many people were killed in Egypt yesterday? 235 people. The worst terrorist attack ever in Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula. Many of them being children. Oh my God. On Black Friday, November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving, 235 people were killed. Most of them were children. 120 people were wounded. This is like 5 separate Las Vegas attacks all happening at once from different angles. And it started while the victims were at prayer. So like the praying Native Americans. The only difference between the Egypt massacre and the massacre at Mystic was there was more dead bodies at Mystic. John Mason, this in perspective, okay? So the Pound Ridge Massacre was a battle of Keefe's War that took place in March 1644 between the forces of New Netherland and the Wappingers. The Wappingers, specifically the Sewanoi and the Wet'quaesgeek. The Wet'quaesgeek and the Sewanoi bands of the Wappinger Confederacy. I've heard that they were Muncie. I've also heard that they were Delaware or Lenape. In February 1644, March 1644, April 1644 was when they were torturing those poor 7 Native Americans who did not steal any pigs, who didn't do anything whatsoever. Underhill slaughtered 500 to 700 Lenape, thought to be of the Sewanoi and the Wet'quaesgeek bands of the Wappinger Confederacy. When it comes to Thanksgiving, why was there Thanksgiving? Because of the massacre of the Pequot. That was a Thanksgiving day. That was the 1637 Thanksgiving. Then there was the 1676 Thanksgiving, which they killed the Wampanoags. The original Massasoit Native Americans, they put Metacomet's head on a pike, and then they put that pike in the middle of town for 2 decades to scare the shit out of everybody. That's the original Native Americans. So go back to your William Bradford, your pilgrims, your nice little Christian pilgrims with the buckle in their hats, and they're so Christian and so loving and so genocidal and psychotic. They did not give a shit about the destruction that they caused. They killed more people than in the Egyptian massacre. The thing about that Massasoit shakedown in 1621 was that they were afraid that the secular free society of the Netherlands would corrupt their children. They wanted to go to the New World so they can indoctrinate their own children with their own bullshit. And so, 40% of the original pilgrims starved to death the first winter. So out of the 102 pilgrims, 44 are going to die. So that's the pilgrims. You know, death is all around. They went in the wintertime because they weren't looking for civilization. Most of them in it for commercial interest. And they wanted not religious freedom, they wanted religious strictness. They wanted to build an ideal Christian commonwealth in which they could brainwash their kids, and their kids wouldn't be enticed or seduced by the freedom of being a successful colony. The Plymouth Plantation is going to be swallowed up by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Boston, in 1691. So the Plymouth Plantation, 40% of them died the first winter. They're massacring people left and right, maybe not in Plymouth, but Massachusetts and Connecticut. And Plymouth eventually becomes Massachusetts Bay in 1691 because Plymouth Colony was a failure. So Plymouth Colony failed, and yet, 40% of them died, but they're the ones that we celebrate every year. And the Wampanoags would get wiped out. We celebrate Thanksgiving for that in 1676. Great day for killing the Metacomet and the Wampanoags. Massacre, genocide. Where are the Wampanoags today? And then the Pequot War was just killing children. It was worse than that terrorist attack in Egypt. And there's one person in Missouri that was killed because of the Black Friday festivities. I mean, look at this shit. Mystic River Massacre, 400 to 800 dead bodies. 235 people were killed in Egypt. In Connecticut, 400 to 800 people. That's what we celebrate every year. Genocide in the Pequot. In Gettysburg, 3,000 people were dying every day. The U.S. dropped the nuclear bombs, killing 40,000. August 9th, 1945, killing 75,000 in one moment. So killing over 100,000 people in 2 different days. 40,000 one day, 70,000. These are estimates. So when you compare the Muncie Massacre, the Wappinger Massacre, there was 500 to 700 people killed. That's more than 235. That's more than 235. In conclusion, when you put the death tolls side by side, you see that the Pilgrims killed way more people than ISIS did in Egypt. So they're going to crack down on terrorism now. Sisi has his 9/11, and so all freedom, it's a military dictatorship. There is no democracy. There is no freedom in Egypt. And we finance them. The United States government gives millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, to Egypt to oppress their own citizens. So look at the body counts, right? Gettysburg and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were way worse. 3,000, 75,000. 235 is bad. It's really bad. It's way more than the Las Vegas massacre, the Texas church shooting, but the Egyptian Revolution saw 846 people get killed. To bring this final point on home, I got 2 things about John Underhill. So the Wappinger Confederacy, both 1644 when he was in the employ of the Dutch, and there was also British colonists that were in his, there was 130 men with Underhill. So John Underhill, he just loves slaughtering people and killing children. John Underhill killed 400 to 800 people at Mystic River Massacre. He copied that massacre at Stonington, copied that massacre in Fairfield, wiped out all the Pequot. 400 to 800 is greater than 235. 235 people were killed in Egypt, maybe a couple dozen more. We'll find out if the people who were injured die. But 235 is much less than 800. 235 is much less than 700. So the Wappinger and the Mystic River Massacre were more than twice as bad as the Egyptian terrorist attack that just happened.